speeches.
Do you want
I don't know
me
if
to do
that's a
that?
tradition we want to start or not. So I'll introduce each speaker tonight with just one sentence. And I will tell the speakers that they have the opportunity, except for Josh,
Okay.
to write something down if you'd like me to introduce you with a sentence. I'll be happy to do that. If not, I will make one up,
I'll do it.
which is what I'm going to do for
like
Josh.
that.
Fine, you can make one.
Yeah.
Josh Tannenbaum was born in Nome, Alaska, where he was raised by a wolf before his real parents found him. He was only about 3. A lot of people don't know that about Josh. He's a very interesting fellow. He still howls at the moon at times, and if you're lucky with him, if you're lucky to be around him during a full moon, you'll actually see some of that regression. It's pretty interesting. He is our first speaker tonight. He's speaking in favor of using mental illness as a valid defense. Josh Tannenbaum.
Product of a severe mental disease, mens rea, criminal intent, clear and convincing evidence, the McNaughton rule. These are many terms associated with the defense of mental illness. Tonight I will speak in favor of using mental illness as a valid defense and explain why. First, what is the insanity defense? Well, the insanity defense first came out of England. It was called the McNaughton rule. There was a man named McNaughton who tried to assassinate the Prime Minister of England, and he believed that evil forces were working against him, so he had to kill the Prime Minister. To make a long story short, he killed someone who was not the Prime Minister, and he went to trial, and he was acquitted on mental defense. And eventually that defense made its way to the United States. It's a lot of our laws come out of England. And in the United States, the McNaughton rule is the law found in most states. And under the McNaughton rule, if you have a severe mental disease or product of a severe mental defect, and you do not understand the idea of a wrong, that what you're doing is a criminal act, because in America, to commit a criminal act, you have to have an act and a thing called mens rea, or criminal intent. And because of that, if the court finds that, you are judged not guilty by reason of insanity. With the insanity defense, I've never been a criminal defense lawyer, though I've defended insurance companies who I thought were big criminals. The attorney for the person has to go up there and plead guilty. I had a friend of mine who's a criminal defense attorney, and I asked him, you decide to take that route, you have to admit, I'm guilty. And if the jury decides not to agree to that, which it rarely works, it's not a good tactic to take, you're guilty. And it doesn't matter, the trial's over, and they go to the sentencing portion. And when you get to that point where if the jury finds you're guilty of, not guilty by reason of insanity, the judge has to make a decision. And if the judge accepts it, that person goes to a mental institution or usually they're prisons. We have one in California named Patton State Hospital. I don't know if anyone ever heard of that. It's a prison for the mentally ill. The defense, as I said, is rarely successful because you're taking a big leap of faith. Because as an attorney, if I'm having my client plead guilty and I lose, it's all over. It is a valid defense, I believe, because often the people who are mentally ill, if you look at the time they're going to serve, it's about the same. I looked at a study by a prominent sociologist named Eric Silver out of NYU, and he looked at data for decades. And he found out that the mentally ill spend just as much time, if not more, in the states of California and New York in a mental hospital. Usually they never get released. And we have this defense because it's something that's morally right, because to commit a crime in America, you have to have that intent. If you have this mental disease and you don't appreciate what you're doing, how can you find somebody guilty? And a lot of the people who they find guilty by reason of insanity, they do have some product of some mental disease, unfortunately. And I'm sure a lot of people out here know someone in their family or a friend who's mentally ill, And they don't always know what they're doing. They don't know whether what they're doing is right or wrong. And with the mental, as I'm going back to the defense, you have to prove it by a standard called clear and convincing, which is a very high standard for a jury to believe. It's a defense that is rarely successful, but according to our society, it is morally right to give these people who are mentally ill a chance to get the help they need. Because if you do send them to prison, oftentimes the mentally ill do not get the help. In our prison systems, we call it the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, but if anyone has ever talked to people who work there, rehabilitation is over here. It's always the correctional phase. Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you, Josh. Our first con speaker is Richard Bauman. One thing that you don't know or that you need to know about Richard that you probably don't know is that he was born in the south of Spain. He can speak Italian, French, Portuguese, Tagalog, as well as English. And Richard has a very unique ability. He can stand up in front of you and start talking to you about a topic that is so mundane, he'll put you to sleep in 30 seconds. Take him up on that one day. Anyway, our first con speaker, Richard Bauman.
Fellow Toastmasters, should insanity be a valid defense for criminal behavior? I'd say in almost every case, no. My perspective on the topic has to do with the fact that there is no black and white distinction between those who are sane and those who are insane. I believe that there is a spectrum, an entire spectrum of sanity and insanity across the population, and at any given point in time, an individual can vary from one to the other. Think back to your own experience. Haven't there been times in your life when you have been either so angry, so distraught, so upset, when you would act in a very irresponsible and crazy way, only to regret it immensely the next day? Were you insane at the time? Probably not. That was a normal reaction to a very traumatic and challenging event. When people commit crimes that shows a lot of premeditated thought, they are demonstrating that they have thought about what they are doing. If we look at the example of this gentleman who was in the news, in and out of the news, he's the theater shooter in Aurora, Colorado. Just a couple of days ago, the prosecution announced that they will seek the death penalty. He not only planned for months the attack in the theater, he rigged his apartment with bombs, knowing that people would come to the apartment, and he had traps waiting for them. He was a PhD student in neuroscience at the local university, a very intelligent man, and yet look at what he did. He killed 12 people and wounded, in some estimates, up to 60 people. Was that insane? One is tempted to say something as extreme as that clearly is evidence of insanity. Should he be held accountable for his actions or simply put away someplace? We have to look at it from two perspectives. Should people who are insane, i.e. troubled, and yet obviously intelligent based on their academic background, and obviously able to plan the heinous crime that he committed, try to cover his tracks, and rig his apartment, that shows awareness of what he was doing and what the consequences should be. As a society, I think that we have no other answer to say to people who do things like this than you knew what you were doing and you need to be held accountable. Each of us can vary from one end of the spectrum to the other based on circumstances in our life at any given moment. And no matter what, we have to be accountable for what we said in a moment of anger, did, in a moment of impulsive spending, whatever the situation may be. There are no excuses. And for people who plan actions that harm other people, their property, or society's state of well-being, sense of rationale, there should be no alternative but to say, you are responsible for what you did, you knew better, and you need to be held accountable. Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you, Richard. First rebuttal, Josh Tenenbaum.
I have someone who committed a crime. However, they have an IQ of 50, they have Down syndrome, they have schizophrenia. That person, due to their schizophrenia, their mental retardation, they kill somebody. We can't, the mental insanity defense, that is something for that person, and say they did not know what they did was wrong. Are we going to go find them and put them to death because they didn't know what they were doing? As for the Colorado shooter, I don't know if they're using the insanity defense for this man, because his attorney, if he takes the insanity defense and the jury doesn't believe it, guess what happens? He's found guilty and the trial's over. The insanity defense is used when someone has a severe mental disease. As I mentioned, schizophrenia, that is a very severe disease. Bipolar, and there are other diseases out there. People under the effect of these diseases, they don't always know what they're doing. They don't have the intent. That's why we have the mental insanity defense. It's something that we have because we do not want to send people to prison or for the death penalty because they don't have that intent. Remember back in 1992, there was a candidate named Bill Clinton. And in Arkansas, there was a man who was sentenced to death. And he had a very low IQ. In fact, he was classified as mentally retarded. And he had to make a decision whether that man should be executed or not. As what happened was Clinton did not give him pardon and he was executed. The insanity defense is not perfect. However, when you raise it, it is up to a 12-man jury and women to decide whether they accept it. They don't have to accept the insanity defense. In fact, most of the time, they do not accept it. But it is a valid defense, it's out there, and it protects society because of people who are severely mentally retarded and they don't have that intent from being convicted of crimes they didn't intend to do. Mr. Toastmaster.
Mr. Don.
John, fellow Toastmasters and my most worthy opponent. I actually believe that Josh has made a valid point regarding low IQ people. They are incapable of understanding the consequences of their behavior. And I said at the beginning of my position statement, my position speech, that I felt in most cases the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity was not warranted. I would grant that there are people whose mental capabilities are so low compared to those of the general population that they could perhaps conduct an act and not even be aware of what they're doing, any more than we would hold a non-human, an animal, guilty of doing something that's basically instinctive for them. What my argument is based on is what I believe to be an abuse of the plea. If we look back at the man who shot President Reagan, he was actually found not guilty by reason of insanity. I don't think that was right. When you look at what happened, he knew what he was doing. He planned for a long time to smuggle a gun to the parade route and shoot the president. What I am opposed to are such what I consider egregious violations of people saying, I had a fit of temporary insanity. I think, give me a break. Temporary insanity, you mean you were insane long enough so that you're not accountable for what you did, but then it's over and you're back to normal and you can function in society, and you basically just got off scot-free for this crime that you committed. I don't buy it. Given that insanity is not a state but a spectrum, each one of us is somewhere on that spectrum, and maybe a different point on that spectrum, different days of the week. Nonetheless, each of us has to be accountable. So in the rare exceptions of people who absolutely cannot comprehend what they're doing, other than that, each person has to be accountable for their actions. Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you, Richard. Our second pro speaker tonight is VJ, who's unfortunately not here, so Cheryl has kindly volunteered to step in for the question. As far as an introduction, the only thing that I need to tell you about Cheryl Wronski is where she was born. It says everything about who she is today, who she was, where she was raised. Bouncy, Ohio. Cheryl Wronski.
Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters. There's no question that this is an emotionally charged topic. There is no, at this time, there's no black and white. However, if the reality is that when you admit to insanity, you're basically doing away with your own defense, then why would anybody do it if they weren't guilty of the crime? Look at it from the standpoint of someone that commits a crime, and then they use it as a defense, saying, well, I was temporarily insane, or I'm mentally ill. There are genuine mental illnesses out there, one that requires medication. I know someone right now who's, well, they're not a child, but they're in their early 20s, that have finally been diagnosed with bipolar. There are certain degrees of bipolar. A degree that can cause a person to not know the difference between right and wrong. Questions that one asks oneself before one pleads insanity is, does the law in a certain state recognize the insanity defense? If a person isn't cognizant enough to ask that question, then perhaps there is a valid defense of insanity. It was brought up earlier, certain people with certain IQs. If these people have not been fortunate enough in their early life to have been trained to be at least semi-functioning, to have been protected or given the training to at least function to a certain degree, if they have the equivalent of an 18-month-old or a 2-year-old, there is a celebrity right now that is dealing with that. His child is 20 years old, and she basically capped off her mentality at the age of 2. So she's a 20-year-old with certain physical aspects and mental aspects of a 2-year-old. If she commits a crime, should she be sentenced to prison or to a mental institution where she will not get the proper care that she deserves? Those are questions we all need to ask ourselves. As for the temporary insanity defense, while it is true that anybody with a certain level of maturity and mentality can stop themselves, hence the term seeing red, have we not all had that moment where I'm so furious with you, him, her, it, at, this, that? But does one go out as a reasonable human being and commit a major crime? There is a line there where illness takes over that reasoning. As far as premeditation, again, that goes back to the law and to the defense. Whatever laws are in that state, in that jurisdiction, how much of it is considered premeditation, how much of it is considered based on the mental illness. It wasn't an impulse. When that person with the mentality of a 4-year-old, accidentally badly injured a waiter because they asked for chocolate pudding and got vanilla pudding, but they have the mentality of a 4-year-old and smack the person with a plate and send them to the hospital. Is that person, for the 4-year-old mentality, doing the act of a 4-year-old, truly responsible for that act of violence? But if that 20-year-old with the mentality of a 4-year-old goes in and premeditates throwing that plate at a waiter, is that also a matter of their mental illness? I say not at that point, because it was a certain premeditation. But an impulsive act with someone with that kind of mentality should not truly be held responsible according to the laws of their state or their jurisdiction. Again, there's a lot of questions here to ask. One of them is it required to prove insanity in my state, in my jurisdiction? Was the person insane at the time? Only medical science and the law can ascertain that. Mr.
Especially on short notice. Thank you very much. Our next con speaker, Carolyn Guillot.
Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Ladies and gentlemen, what is mental illness? Can any of you define it? It's almost impossible to define. I think every one of you would have a different definition. Here is one definition. Mental illness, any condition that affects a person's mood, behavior, or thoughts that is distressing or impairs functioning. Don't we have feelings like that every single day? Now the problem with that is that drugs are being prescribed for people whose mood doesn't satisfy them. They want to improve their mood. I want to make a case that mental illness should not be a valid defense because increasingly drugs are being used for getting people out of their moods. I learned some things in reading this article. It lists 10 cases where mass shootings occurred, all with a connection to drugs. How many have heard any mention of drugs being connected with a Connecticut shooting? Why are they keeping it quiet? Could it possibly be because so many drug companies advertise on television? Shouldn't it be exposed how many drugs are being used? In fact, it was in the 1950s that talk therapy was replaced by drug therapy. When drugs were invented, were created for an infection, they found that it blunted mental symptoms. So, and it affected the chemicals in the brain. So they then decided that, or they figured out that mental disorder was the result of a chemical imbalance. So they started finding an imbalanced person to put on the drug. But using drugs can cause a chemical imbalance in somebody who didn't have it before. That is a big problem. So it means that more people are having mental disorders, not fewer. And when people claim mental disability for committing a crime, where is the boundary? When will it stop? There's an increase in usage. There's an 11% of Americans 12 years old and older are on psychotherapeutic drugs. There's a 400% increase in the usage of these drugs in the 20 years from 1988 to 2008. How do they get about that increase? Drug companies are subsidizing drugs. They give gifts to doctors who prescribe them, and there are fringe benefits for using them. Therefore, more people are on drugs, they'll commit more crimes, and if we excuse them for a mental illness, where will it stop? Drugs can trigger a chemical imbalance that didn't exist before. It can even cause the brain to atrophy. Having fewer connections in the brain that it had before, never to return. Therefore, mental illness can affect everyone. Who here does not ever have a problem with a mood or distress or something that affects your behavior, and instead of taking a nap, you go to your doctor and get a drug? More people will be affected, more people will commit crimes. It is something we should not do to give people an excuse for committing a crime by saying they have mental illness. Thank you.
Hearing a rebuttal, Cheryl Johnson.
Caroline made a terrific point when she was talking about the various drugs. We have become a drug nation. There's a book called The Prozac Nation. Certain drugs have become a prop versus verbal treatments, natural treatments, simple exercise to relieve depression. But for a lot of people, it is truly a chemical imbalance in the brain that a lot of times goes untreated. Example, how many kids went through all of grade school and they could have been diagnosed with dyslexia? Not treatable by a drug, but because since they weren't diagnosed when they were kids, they had a lot of hardship and became adults that had problems reading and writing, perhaps holding the job that they had potential. They didn't reach their potential. That's an example. It both goes back to having clear-cut parameters between someone with the horrificness of planning, shooting up a theater, and someone who's smart, in my opinion, someone who's smarter and who's considered a genius, is smart enough to know the difference between right and wrong. And the person who commits a crime, I'm excluding murder in this particular category, I'm talking about other crimes, that has a genuine problem, a genuine chemical imbalance that causes the brain not to work correctly. No different than someone having perhaps undiagnosed diabetes that causes damages to the organ. Same thing, damages to the brain. Again, more clear-cut parameters so that the truly impaired can get a fair defense. Ms. Toastmaster.
Carolyn will do the rebuttal in French.
We will.
Wrong.
Yes, we need to accurately diagnose people with problems. But with the doctors being given gifts by the drug companies to prescribe more of them, how can it be accurate? Drugs make judges make decisions that aren't always constitutional. It's their opinion. Diagnosing somebody with a mental illness is subjective. It's not based on proof. It's not based on data. It's just up to somebody's opinion. How can we allow that to be a defense in a case? My daughter is a therapist at 6 elementary schools. She is called when a child has a problem. One child wanted to commit suicide. She was called in to talk to that child and was able to bring him out of it. Another child was called in because she was having trouble sleeping. She found out that that child had the responsibility at home of loading bullets in a gun when the father felt a need to shoot somebody outside. I guess there were 5 or 7 guns in the house. She now has to write a report about that situation. So I'm sure somebody is going to go into that house. I think when more and more people are diagnosed with having a mental problem at schools, on the workplace, there will be more drugs prescribed, more people on drugs, and we cannot be having that used as an excuse in court.